This video will basically just be a love letter to every single author I've ever loved. Hi, welcome, come on in. My name is Aoife and today I am going to give you my favourite book from every single one of my favourite authors up to now. If you're somebody who's looking to get into their reading but you don't really know where to start, I have got some great suggestions for you. So the first author on my list is Marian Keyes. Marian is not just one of my favourite authors, she's one of my favourite Irish authors, she's one of my favourite chick lit authors because she's not afraid to kind of tackle the hard-hitting subjects. She's not afraid to tackle things like addiction, divorce, abortion, child abandonment, estrangement from your partner. There are so many topics that are included in all of her books. My favourite of her books is Rachel's Holiday. It's the second book in the Walsh Sisters series, but I wouldn't necessarily say that you need to have read Watermelon before you can go on to read Rachel's Holiday. As you can kind of assume from the title, the book is about Rachel, but she's not necessarily taking a holiday. Rachel lives in New York and she has quite a large and quite a loud lifestyle. She has problems with drug addiction, she has problems with drug abuse, she has problems with alcohol addiction and abuse. Throughout flashbacks from the book, you can see just how much this is impacting her everyday life, her relationships with people around her, her relationships with her friends, romantic relationships. Following an overdose in New York, her family collect her from New York and bring her back to Ireland to go to a rehabilitation centre, I think in Wicklow, called the Cloisters. One of my favourite aspects of the whole book is actually the group therapy sessions that Rachel goes through. She is a little bit skeptical about how much they're going to help her, how much do they work, what should she or shouldn't she share with the group when she's there. But you learn so much about the people with whom she's sharing the house. You learn so much about their backgrounds, how they ended up getting here, what their own personal demons are. Marian treats this book with so much care and with so much love, and you really do end up sympathising with absolutely every single one of them there. There are also some pretty funny moments, there are some pretty poignant moments, so if you're looking for a book that kind of does put everything into the one basket, this is the one to go for. One of my all-time absolute favourite auto-buy everything that they read authors is Lindsay Kelk. I have mentioned her here countless times. My favourite book of Lindsay's is probably the one that started it all, and that is I Heart New York. So that's the first in the I Heart series. There are 8 of those, and throughout the series you follow Angela in her life in New York, finding new friends, her new job, her new relationship. But this is the one that very much started it all. Not just Angela's journey, but also Lindsay's career as an author. At the beginning of this book, Angela finds her boyfriend cheating on her at her best friend's wedding. So she goes home, packs up her entire life, and heads for a new place. She heads off to New York, finds a new apartment, finds new best friends, and basically rebuilds her life from there. Throughout this book, there is a kind of a love triangle, and I'm not going to tell you who she ends up with, but it is a really well done love triangle, and you will definitely find yourself siding with one of them. The next book on the list is a lot more hard-hitting and is definitely one that I would say really need to be in the mood for reading. So the next author is Louisa Neal, and the book is Asking for It. This is her second YA book. I think it came out around 2017-18 or so. In this book, you're following Emma, who is in 5th year in secondary school, which is the year before you take your final Leaving Cert exams when you're finishing school in Ireland. Emma is very popular, she's very well liked, she's very beautiful, and she knows this and she uses this quite a lot to her own advantage. One evening she goes out to a party with a lot of friends of hers and is sexually assaulted by a member of the local sports team. Throughout the rest of the book after the incident, you can see the whole community where she lives. You can see everybody going into a he said versus she said, I believe her, I believe him. You see that mentality coming in, and it does bring up quite a lot of questions about respect, about consent, about victim blaming. It's definitely a book that I think every single teenager needs to read in Ireland and wider than that. And it's also something that I think needs to be on a school curriculum so that we can start these conversations about consent and about victim blaming and about sexual assault and what is not okay in the bedroom. The next book is another quite hard-hitting one and another quite hard-hitting YA book, and it's The Places Ive Cryed in Public by Holly Bourne. I read this one maybe late towards the end of last year and I really, really enjoyed it. This one follows Amelie, who has just come out of a relationship with a guy called Reese. And She goes to different places where she had been contemplating their relationship before and starts to look back on it and realize what had been happening between her and Reese wasn't the most healthy of relationships. She was losing quite a lot of herself in the relationship. She was losing quite a lot of her friendships. Her family life was kind of falling apart because of this whole thing. It's definitely a one that I would also recommend that young teenagers read so that they can identify the signs of a toxic relationship, of emotional abuse, because there is a kind of a thought process out there that if you're not being physically abused, then it's not abuse. And that's definitely something that we need to change the thinking of for so many people. Emotional abuse can be very subtle and you don't always recognize the signs of it. So I think if we give teenagers an insight into what the signs are and how it can look a little bit earlier on in life, maybe we can prevent further cases down the line. Let's go back to something a little bit more lighthearted. Next author on my list is Christina Lauren, and the book that I'm going to recommend from theirs was the first book of theirs that I've read, and I think I've been on a downward slope with them since then because nothing has lived up to that, and that is the On Honeymooners. I read this one when it was starting to turn into summer last year and instantly wanted to go and book a flight even though I literally could not leave the country. In the On Honeymooners, you're following Olive, whose twin sister Amy has just gotten married. Olive and the groom's brother Ethan do not get on and haven't gotten on from the very moment they laid eyes on each other. Unfortunately, they are the only two people of the entire wedding party who didn't get cut down by food poisoning at the reception. Because Amy and Dean's honeymoon is already paid for, it's non-refundable and they have to go on it, Olive and Ethan decide to pretend to be their own siblings and go on this honeymoon themselves. The problem now becomes, how do we convincingly be a newlywed, completely head over heels in love with each other couple when we cannot stand to be in the same room as each other? As you can imagine, their thoughts toward each other do start to change before the end of the book, and there are some fantastic steamy scenes in this book. So if you're looking for a really steamy romance, this is the one I would recommend to you. The next author on my list is Isabel Broom, who writes quite a lot of travel fiction. So every book that she's written so far has been set in a beautiful destination anywhere across the world. She's gone everywhere from Greece to Thailand to New Zealand. But the book that I'm going to focus on is set in Prague. So this is a year and a day and follows three different women with three very different relationship types. You've got Megan, who's come to Prague for a winter break with her friend Ollie, and she's hoping that something more can happen between the two of them. You've also got Hope, who's come here on a city break with her partner, but she's realizing that her daughter is left back at home and she's not really in the best mood with Hope and her new partner's relationship. And also there is Sophie, who is coming to Prague by herself, but is waiting for her partner Robin to come and join her here. There are quite a lot of poignant moments in this book. There are quite a lot of uplifting moments in this book, and there's so much love. I also love the moment where three characters who don't know each other at all before they come to the city meet up with each other, form a little friendship group, and kind of get to know each other a little bit more, look out for each other, take each other to little places that they had wanted to see together. I really love Isabel's writing. In a year where travel hasn't been as easy as it would have been before all of this had happened, I think that reading is the easiest way for us to discover everywhere in the world that we had wanted to go, and this is definitely a good way to get that done. Next on the list is Cecilia Ahern, and the book here that I'm going to recommend is Where Rainbows End. You might also have seen this under another title, Love, Rosie, to tie in with the film version, which we don't talk about in this house, by the way, it was awful. Love, Rosie, or Where Rainbows End, follows Rosie and Alex, who are two childhood best friends. They've known each other since they were about 5 or 10 years old. And the entire book is told in a epistolary form. So it is told in letters, in transcript of phone calls, in emails, texts, any kind of communication that they have with each other is written down in the pages of this book. I think this was one of the first books that I'd ever written in epistolary form, and I absolutely fell hook, line and sinker for this completely new storytelling narrative that I'd never seen before. And I think that that's one of the main reasons why it holds such a great place in my heart. But also, I just really love the story and I kind of sink back into it every now and then. So now that we've got quite a few of my adult favourites ticked off, let's go right back to my childhood and talk about some of my favourite books from there. I think we should start with the one that started it all off, Roald Dahl. And my favourite of his books is another book that started it all off, Matilda. Matilda is one of my absolute all-time favourites. I actually re-listened to the audiobook just a couple of weeks ago, and it's narrated by Kate Winslet, who does a phenomenal job with it. So if you're looking for a great audiobook to get you into them, that's a really great place to start. There isn't much more that you can say about Matilda that hasn't already been said. She's a very young girl, but she is probably the brightest person that any of the people in the book know. She can do really complicated mathematics in her head. She taught herself how to read and has read huge tomes like The Old Man and the Sea or stuff by Charles Dickens by the time she's like 4. You also follow Matilda as she goes to public school for the first time, as she meets her new teacher, as she meets her new headmistress, and also what her home life is like when she's very much a neglected and abandoned child by her parents and by her older brother. Next author on the list is Jacqueline Wilson, and I have done a whole video about all of my favourite Jacqueline Wilson books, but for this one I sat down and I really tried to narrow it down to one book. There were a couple that were definite high contenders, but I think overall my absolute favourite all-time book of Jacqueline Wilson's is Double Act. Double Act is weird in that it's about twins, but I am not a twin myself, so I don't understand where I would have had that connection to it. But I always wanted to be a twin, and I think I always wanted to have a sister when I was the age that I read that book for the first time. So reading about Ruby and Garnet and how close they were, how they did everything together, they looked similar, they wore their hair in the same style, they wore the same clothes, they did pretty much everything in mirror of one another. I think reading that when I was sisterless, when I was younger, when I wanted to have a sister, reading that let me live through them vicariously for a little bit. I also went to see a production of this in the Cork Opera House, which is quite close to where I grew up. I think by this stage I would have been about 10 or 11 years old, so maybe slightly outgrown of the book, but it just dragged me straight back into it and I loved it all over again. Final author on the list, and we're going into my teenage years, is Meg Cabot. And I think here you're expecting me to say The Princess Diaries, but you would be wrong. My favourite book of Meg Cabot's is not The Princess Diaries, and it's not any of the Princess Diaries series, it's actually All American Girl. This is one that I think flies under the radar so far, people don't even know that it exists. But All American Girl is about a young girl called Samantha Madison who is an artist. She really wants to be a really famous artist. So her mother sends her off to this kind of prestigious art course that's in the city where she lives, which is Washington, D.C. And she doesn't really get on with the course. She doesn't really like the teacher. She doesn't like her teaching methods. So she decides to skip it out for the next week and doesn't really tell anybody. She just goes into a local record store and has a look at what's there and what's on offer. When she comes out of the record store, however, she accidentally comes across an assassination attempt on the President of the United States and thwarts this assassination attempt completely. Not only does she now have to contend with all of the media circus that has brought upon herself, but she's also starting to grow feelings for the president's young son, David. I loved their relationship when I was growing up, and I absolutely have got to read that book again. There's also a second book to the series, so if you really liked that one, I would recommend you go on to Ready or Not as well. Those are all of my favourite authors and my favourite books by all of them. So if you are looking to get into some of their reading, that is where I would recommend that you go. Who is your favourite author and what's your favourite book by them? Don't forget to like and subscribe because I have new videos up every week. Now, get on out of here.